Hello and welcome to episode 59 of A Slice of Medieval. Rather unusually, Derek and I have books being released on the same day, 30th January 2025, and they are both historical non-fiction. So we thought we would do an episode that would be a sort of unofficial book launch and introduce you to two of this year's most amazing must-have books. My own Scotland's Medieval Queens from St Margaret, Margaret of Denmark, and A Guide to the Wars of the Roses. That's Derek's. So Derek, I suppose we should first talk about what made us write the books. How did A Guide to the Wars of the Roses come about?
Well, it started, I think it was about 2018. I started a series of podcasts on the Wars of the Roses, and they're just short 15-minute, 16-minute podcasts tracing the origins of the Wars of the Roses and the events and trying to explain things. And the purpose of the podcasts was partly to act as a kind of handy background tool to accompany my fictional books on the Wars of the Roses, and partly to address an increasing number of myths that were being propagated both online and in print. So there was a kind of dual purpose to it. Anyway, so the idea of those was that they were short, snappy, people could dip into them or not as they pleased. But I know that a lot of students use them because they were short and snappy and so on, and hopefully historically accurate. So a couple of people approached me and said, well, is it available in print? Is it available in book form? And of course I had to say no, but then over the years I thought, well, it would be handy to produce what it's called, what it says on the tin, A Guide to the Wars of the Roses. I don't look at any topic in massive depth, but hopefully I explain all the aspects of the Wars of the Roses that someone would want to know, particularly a student or the general reader who's interested in the period. So that's how it came about. And this topic is traditionally, I know because I taught it once to year 9 pupils, and this topic is often regarded as very complicated because everywhere you look, there's an Edward, a Henry, a Richard, or whatever, and it's all very confusing. And one of my aims by breaking it up into short bits was to try and make it easier to follow, because I don't actually think the topic as a whole is that complicated. It's just that there are so many people involved who have sort of prominent, even though they're maybe brief, roles to play. So that's basically where it came from. So what about Scottish Queens? Where did that come from?
Scotland's Medieval Queens actually came from, it was my son's idea, and it's all Macbeth's fault. He was doing his English Lit GCSE. He was studying Macbeth, and he came out of school one day, got in the car and said, Mum, you've got to do something about Lady Macbeth. I was like, what do you mean? He says, well, Shakespeare really did a number on her, as bad as Richard III, and nobody's defending her. There isn't a society for Lady Macbeth. He doesn't even tell you her name. So I'm sat there with him going, okay, actually, that might be a good idea, because I absolutely adore Scottish history. I've been interested in Robert the Bruce and the stories around Robert the Bruce since reading Nigel Tranter's Bruce trilogy in my early 20s. So I've always been familiar with Scottish history and gravitated towards Scottish history books. So it was like, yeah. And if you look on my blog, I've got articles on Elizabeth de Burgh, Robert the Bruce's queen, Ada de Warenne, who was the daughter-in-law of David I of Scotland. And there's a few women I'd already covered. So I was thinking, actually, it wouldn't. Oh, and St Margaret,
Mm.
Queen of Scots, as the wife of Malcolm
Yeah.
Canmore, who'd been in a couple of my books already, Silk and the Sword and Heroines of the Medieval World, and Women of the Anarchy, thinking about it. So I was familiar with some of it already.
Yeah.
And the idea of Lady Macbeth, and like he says, she is basically blamed for Macbeth murdering Duncan. And then she goes mad with the guilt. And it's like, she did none of that, the poor woman. And she did have a name. She was called Gruach. And she's the first Scottish queen that we actually know the name
Mm.
of. And yet nobody mentions her. She has gone down in history as this horrible woman, thanks to Shakespeare. So although the book starts, the title says from St Margaret, who actually comes after Lady Macbeth, the prologue is Lady Macbeth and trying to set the story
Mm.
straight. We don't have an awful lot of information on her, so it wasn't like I was going to be able to write a full biography of her. But thanks to Lewis, I thought she really did deserve to be in the book, and she was certainly the inspiration for the book.
Have you rehabilitated her then?
I hope so. I really do. She sounds like a fascinating woman.
Mm.
And she was a royal as well in her own right. It is possible that Macbeth married her to enhance his own claims to the throne because she was a granddaughter of a
Yeah.
king. So she had a claim to the throne in her own right. Not that anyone would have
No.
even thought for a moment that a woman could rule in 11th century Scotland
Mm.
or 11th century England.
Mm.
But it's interesting to see that when you think about it, Macbeth and she didn't have children, but she had a son, Lulach, from her first marriage. And Macbeth actually adopted him and made him his heir,
Yeah. Yeah.
which you don't see anywhere else in English or Scottish history
Yeah.
that a king would do that to have an heir who is not of his own blood, but adopted. It was very rare, and yet he did that in the 11th century because it was Gruach, and Lulach had a claim to the throne through his mother. So yeah, it was interesting to actually look into her
Mm.
and present the Macbeth story, and then actually present the real story.
Yeah. It's a testament really to Shakespeare's literary skills that his take on the stories he wrote,
Yes,
plays he wrote, has influenced the public psyche really in terms of
yeah,
these
so much.
individuals from the past. And I
Mm.
mean, as I always say, Shakespeare was writing stories, it's fiction. Don't go off on one because Shakespeare says something, because he's
Mm.
writing stories. But
Yeah, Richard the Third murdering people when he
yeah,
was what, three
yeah,
years old and things like that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? That we would never take. Oh, I suppose we do actually. When you think of some authors, people take their theories, fictional theories, as fact, and you
Oh, they
know,
do. Yeah. Yeah.
poor Margaret Beaufort now gets blamed for killing the princes thanks to novels rather than any historical research.
Yeah. That's in the book. That's dealt with in the book, along with a whole load of other rubbish.
So, somebody said to me the other day, there's been a lot of books on
Hmm.
the Wars of the Roses. What makes a guide to the Wars of the Roses different from those others?
I think its USP, as it were, is the fact that some of these people in the whole saga of the Wars of the Roses, they've become legendary. They've become caricatures almost, rather than real people. And every year that goes by, more legendary and mythical aspects are added, and nothing is ever stripped away. And I mean, I
Mm,
feel sorry for Richard III because he carries a lot on his back, shall I say? But they all do. The Earl of Warwick, Margaret Beaufort, you mentioned, they all are now traipsing around the planet with a whole load of stuff that everybody's lumbered on them.
mm,
And so the aim of A Guide to the Wars of the Roses was to strip away all that, to strip away 500 years of hype, basically, and try to present what happened as if it's real people doing things, not, what we'd like perhaps somebody to be like. So I tried to piece together basically what happened, and on balance, why. What were the motives of these people?
Yeah.
Things are very glibly said these days on this subject with absolutely no evidence at all. And then they're repeated, especially online. So what I was trying to do, I was saying to myself at the start, well, if you actually want some handholds, if you want to know what happened without any hype, I don't care whether Richard III killed the prince or not. I honestly don't. I don't care. It's
Philistine.
irrelevant anyway. But what were they doing and why? That's the difference between this book on the Wars of the Roses and others, I would suggest.
I must say, I do like, I've only read about a quarter of it at the minute, but I do like the way you offer the alternatives of what they could have done, especially with Richard, Duke of
Mm.
York and the time of Henry VI
Yeah.
incapacity. It's like they had options, but a lot of them were least worst options.
Yeah, I mean that you mentioned that particular moment, and everybody assumes that the idea of Queen Margaret of Anjou becoming regent was never considered or was totally dismissed out of hand.
Mm,
That's just not true. She obviously wanted to be regent, and the council had to consider it. It wasn't it
mm.
wasn't impossible for the Queen to be regent.
No, it had happened
It
before.
did happen from time to time, but they considered it and decided it wasn't the best thing to do. And you have to take that, and unfortunately, the whole, again, it's all the hype around Margaret, the she-wolf, or
Yes.
another she-wolf. There's so many of them, it's difficult to
Don't like that label.
I know, this is it. And we've talked about her before, but yeah, so you're right. The guide tries to say, well, this is what I think happened and why, but these are the options people had at the time.
Mm.
Why did they choose the course they chose? That's what I'm trying to do. It's not always possible, of course.
Well, no. But it does work well, certainly in those first ones when it's all political rather than military. And I did think, when I was reading it, I'm there thinking, did they actually realize at any point, at what point did they realize they were in a war? And it wasn't just because you look at the first Battle of St Albans, and that's a skirmish, technically an assassination
Yeah,
of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of
yeah.
Somerset. But they wouldn't have seen that as the opening salvos
No.
of a war that would go on for another 30 years.
No, and it's always set in that light, but it,
Mm,
it wasn't seen in that way at the time.
no.
Hopefully, I've tried to explain why that one battle didn't settle everything and why there was then,
Mm,
further disputes. So yeah, that's the aim of it, to try and get to the nub of all these individual little crises.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? They're all little crises until you get to what, 1459 to 1461, where it all
Mm.
properly kicks off. Richard, Duke of York's killed, Edward IV becomes king. They just could be seen as separate spats. You don't know they're building up to this change of
Yeah,
monarchy.
well, I mean, in a way, though, they're not building up. You've got three separate political crises in the Wars of the Roses, which is what the book tries to explain. And yes, they're connected, but one does not lead to the
Mm,
other. There are other factors which cause another crisis. And this whole thing that it's inevitable almost that
yeah.
Richard Duke of York's going to try to take the throne, and then his son, and so on and so forth. That's just not the case, basically. But it's set in people's minds.
Yeah, I think we have this tendency to see that the way things end up is the way that we're always going to end up.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I've tried to do, is to say, look, forget about what we know happened.
Mm,
At the time, before all that happened, what were people thinking and why did they do what they did? Because most of the history of the Wars of the Roses seems to be written
yeah.
with hindsight. and I don't think you can do that if you want to get to
Mm.
the truth of things. So, medieval Scottish queens. If I ask you what that's about, that's a pretty stupid question, really. So,
As you say, it does what it says on the
yeah.
tin.
So, and has there been a book on these queens as a sort of separate book? How many times has that been done?
When I was writing it, there was only one other that I was aware of,
Hmm.
which I did use quite an awful lot. And it was Scotland's Queens from St Margaret all the way up through to the end of the Stuarts,
Yeah.
Queen Anne in 1714.
Hmm.
So the actual medieval queens were covered in 100 pages.
Yeah.
There could have been more detail added. So I actually thought there isn't a book like this looking at
Hmm.
the medieval
The
queens.
medieval aspect.
So
Yeah.
it was quite interesting to actually have to go deep in because no other book had gone deep enough.
Hmm.
And then since then, Heather Darcy has published the Stuart Spouses. So she sort of crosses the medieval as
Yeah.
well as the early modern. So she goes from
Right.
Robert II all the way through to
Yeah.
Queen Anne again. But nobody has really looked into the earlier ones.
Hmm.
And they were, I mean, Scotland has such a rich history.
Yeah. It's
Um,
fascinating, isn't it?
yeah, it really is. And they don't, I mean, having their strong southern neighbour in England has never helped them, has rarely
Hmm.
helped them.
Hmm.
So it's always politically fraught. Certainly, the Stuart kings weren't probably didn't expect to die in their beds, especially the Jameses. I think there was one of them who died in his bed. Everybody else
Yeah.
murdered, killed by cannon,
Yeah.
killed in battle. It is.
Yeah.
So I've always been attracted to it because it does have quite a violent history, but it's a clever political history as well. And
Hmm.
I mean, you look at Outlaw King when that came out a few years ago.
Hmm.
That was telling the story of Robert the Bruce.
Yeah.
And yes, his wife Elizabeth de Burgh was in it. And I think they mentioned Marjorie, his daughter, when Edward I tried to put her in a
That's
cage
right.
and then
Yes.
got persuaded not
Hmm.
to. But Robert the Bruce's story has some really strong women in it. Two of his
Hmm.
sisters, Isabel Buchan, who crowned him despite the fact that she was married to a Comyn, who were Robert the Bruce's mortal enemies. And these women just if they got mentioned, it was only in passing in
Hmm.
Outlaw King, and yet they were such a big part of the Robert the Bruce
Yeah.
story. So there was plenty to explore, and a lot of it had been brushed over before to keep with the kings and the fighting.
Yeah.
And it was like some of these women did incredible things. And I mean, the reason Scotland and England were at peace for 70 odd years in the 13th century was because of a woman.
Hmm.
It was because Henry III's daughter, Margaret of England, was married to Alexander III of Scotland. And the fact that Henry III was the longest reigning medieval monarch in
Hmm.
England, and his daughter was married to the Scottish king, they always had that connection where they could talk to each other
Hmm.
rather than go to war. They had political crises, but they never went to war. And it's interesting, just things like that. You look at it, and a lot of the influence of the women has been totally ignored, but it was there.
What I found interesting, particularly in the early, well, maybe the first half, was the way in which Scottish and English history kind of meshes together.
Mm,
And the marriages are kind of the means by which that happens most of the time.
yeah,
So, as you say, Henry III's reign, but also much earlier than that, St Margaret and so on. You've got
yes.
these connections which link the two
Mm,
countries, and we always think the image of England and Scotland is that they're at loggerheads all the time, which they were at times, and
mm,
cross-border raiding was a thing of every year probably, but there's still this connection. And I think one of the things your book does really well is it shows that meshing, that
mm.
those
Thank
connections
you.
between England and Scotland,
Yeah.
some of which I was completely unaware of, to be honest.
It's funny actually when you look at it. There were a lot of English women who married Scottish kings.
Mm.
But I can't think of a Scottish woman who married an English king. But then when you look at it again, English kings tended to marry French
Was
princesses.
Matilda, Henry the First queen, was she Scottish or was she English?
Yes, yes, you're right, she was. But
Yeah,
when you look at England and
but there
France,
aren't many.
no. And when you look at England and France, English kings tended to marry French queens
Mm.
or queens from French territories. But I can't think of an English princess who became Queen of France until Henry VIII's sister.
Mm. She
So,
wasn't Queen of France for long.
no.
No.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that England didn't look to Scotland for wives. Like you say, there's Matilda of Scotland who married Henry I. But it's also about timing when
Mm.
princesses were ready to be married and if there was a king looking for a bride at the time.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was an interesting observation, but it doesn't mean that England and Scotland weren't always trying to find a middle road.
Mm.
Because you look throughout the history, yes, Henry II and Edward I were trying to dominate Scotland. And Scotland pushed back,
Mm.
William the Lion pushed back,
Yeah.
and Robert the Bruce certainly pushed back. But they're they're still trying to find a middle road just to get on together.
Well,
And
yeah, because they're on the same island, aren't they? So
yeah,
there
exactly.
has to be some coexistence. You can't have perpetual war, otherwise you'd both countries would be
Mm.
exhausted and depleted of resources.
And I think it says a lot about Scotland, which is the smaller neighbour, that they were never conquered by England.
Mm.
You know, they were resilient. They did use diplomacy and politics and English brides
Mm.
in order to keep the peace and promote their own
Yeah,
interests. So, Derek, this is your actual first non-fiction book,
it
isn't it?
is. Yes, scary thought.
Yeah. Was it a greater challenge to write? Because you see, I've written a short story in fiction, but all my others have been non-fiction, and I actually find non-fiction easier.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so basically, I just made it all up as usual, really. No, I didn't. I'm lying. No, it's all true. Well, the challenge was, I mean, I like writing, so that was okay. But the challenge was to go further than the podcast because, as I said, it started, the basis of it was the podcast. But the podcasts weren't intended to be a guide to the Wars of the Roses, merely handholds almost.
Mm,
So in the book, I needed to flesh things out. I needed sometimes to give more evidence, which the podcast, the shortness of the podcast didn't allow, to give a bit more clarity. So I had to do a bit more research, and I also had to explain things more fully than I did in the podcast because it's a different medium. So if you're looking at a book, I've got the space to expand and to put forward a lot more detail than in the podcast.
mm,
So that was a challenge because it meant changing how I'd done some things, and it meant, as I said, doing more research. The biggest challenge in this period, it wasn't so much the non-fiction, it was Richard III, really. I mean, it was trying to get past the fact that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, somebody is going to want to know what you think about Richard III.
mm,
And I was determined to treat Richard hopefully exactly the same as all the other main protagonists in the Wars of the Roses, and not in some way to elevate him and write more about him or less about him than any of the others, but to try and just go with what I felt was accurate and reasonable. So dealing with Richard III and all that goes with him was a bit of a challenge. And I get that these people are great characters. I mean, obviously I write fiction mostly, so they're great characters. And I
mm,
did a lot with them in fiction. With this, I had to sort of switch that to non-fiction and say, okay, this is a different thing entirely. And hopefully people who've read my fiction books will see that there may be elements of style which are similar, but the content is very much non-fiction. So
Mm.
hopefully I've managed to achieve that. But yeah, that was the most difficult part of it, was anything to do with Richard III. And the overall challenge was to expand on the podcast and give a bit more depth to it.
I do find your writing style is very easy to engage with because it is very much, well, you've perfected it as a fiction author, so you know how to tell a
Yeah,
story.
hopefully.
And and that does come across. It is very easy to read, and there's some brilliant little asides in there that make me
Well,
smile.
that the object of
So,
the exercise was for it to be easy to read, because otherwise there's no point in
mm,
me writing it, because the purpose of the exercise, as I said earlier, was to explain, to make things straightforward that weren't necessarily straightforward, and for people to understand what's going on. It
mm.
is a story anyway. It's just a question of, it's a factual story.
Yeah. And I also think some Wars of the Roses books expect a certain level of knowledge from readers.
Mm,
And yours doesn't. You introduce the characters, make sure everybody knows who
yeah.
each of the characters is and how they're related. And sometimes you don't get that in Wars of the Roses books. There's a certain level of knowledge
Yeah.
already expected.
Yeah. And that again was part of the remit, really, was to ensure that I didn't leave anybody behind.
Mm,
And I think that does happen. You're right. It does happen, particularly with a topic that's like the Wars of the Roses, as I said to start with, where you've got so many characters in the story. And you've got four Dukes of Somerset and three Dukes of York, probably, and umpteen other people. And
mm,
trying to make sure that you don't lose somebody in the saying, well, who the hell is he? I mean, what I tried to do was say at the start of a chapter, maybe, or during a chapter, say, well, folks, you might remember this guy who did this. Well, we've come back to him again,
mm.
because otherwise it is, if you just look at it sort of in terms of what happened and you assume a level of knowledge, that's why the topic becomes difficult for people.
Yes.
So hopefully I've managed to achieve that. So what about you? What was the challenge, the greatest challenge in because you're obviously an experienced writer of non-fiction. So what challenge was there in dealing with medieval Scottish queens?
Well, the main challenge actually was that there isn't a lot written about them.
Mm,
Like I said, there was one book already. And so you had to actually, I'm not saying I don't use primary sources, but I do like some secondary sources just to give me the basic
yeah,
knowledge before I go into the
yeah.
primary sources, but they weren't there. So you had to go back to the very beginning and do the primary sources and the actually the Foundation for Medieval Genealogy was a real help for me to find where people were related and things like that
Mm,
because it was some of the information was you just think I don't know all these people. I thought I knew Scottish history,
yeah.
but I only know the top level of it, especially in the
Mm,
early 11th and 12th centuries. It was a very different time. I hadn't realized. We talk about primogeniture being introduced into England about the time of King John.
mm,
They say when Richard the Lionheart died, the choice was between Arthur, who was the son of Richard's brother, and John, who was the son of Richard's father.
mm,
And primogeniture, the eldest surviving son, wasn't an established rule of thumb.
no.
Well, it was the same in Scotland, but they practiced something called Tannist succession, which was basically the eldest male relative of the royal family succeeded,
Mm,
which means he could be a nephew, an uncle, a cousin, and it was just which one was the oldest, he got to be king.
mm,
So you never had any regencies. There was never a child king in Scotland until the middle of the medieval period. And when it happened, it was 13th century.
yeah.
And they were like,
Mm,
what do we do now? We've got a 7-year-old who's going to be king. How do we deal with this? And they had to actually look to Henry III in England to help them with the regency because they didn't know
mm,
they'd never had it. It wasn't a challenge that you would get unless you had primogeniture.
Mm.
So it was things like that, looking at the Scottish rules of succession and the Scottish laws. They're very different to English ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was fascinating to actually look into this and to read about the way Scottish history developed and the way politics developed in Scotland, different to English politics.
Mm.
But it was also the other challenge was there are some great Scottish chronicles. John of Fordun, Walter Bower, brilliant. Actually, they both seem to have copied each other, so you got a lot of the same stories with them. But there
Are
was
they
one, and
contemporary with each other?
yeah, but there was one Andrew of Windtown, which is actually written in Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic. So it was like, okay, even Google Translate falls short here. You've got no chance. So it was like trying to find translations of Windtown
Mm.
was not easy. And when I found people saying what he'd actually said, it's like, okay, now I can go back into Windtown and actually find the bit he said and
Mm.
see that they put in English and see if I can work it out from his. So
Yeah.
that was a really big challenge.
That
But
sounds like a difficult challenge.
but it was interesting to be able to find all the sources. And there are some amazing Scottish sources which I
Mm.
never was aware of until writing this book. And luckily, you read people's references to so and so, to Bower or to so and it's like, oh, let me go and find Windtown. And it's like, archive.org is your friend. You know,
Yeah.
they've got so much stuff on there. It's amazing. So when it went down in, was it October? It went down for a week. It was like, oh my God, no, you can't go down. And another challenge has been the fact the British Library hack that we haven't been able to get into
Mm.
the British Library medieval manuscripts
Yeah.
stuff and things like that. So that has been challenging, not being able to get to sources as
Mm.
easily as we could.
Mm.
But hopefully we're getting on the right track with that
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
I think people don't realize how much independent researchers like us,
Use that. Yeah.
if you're affiliated to a university, it's easy to get hold of stuff. But if you're not, you depend on these websites that do, like
Mm.
archive.org and like British Library and the National Archives to find the information and not just actually
Mm.
find the source, but to find where you can find the source.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's right. It's teasing out these documents and so on is a task in itself, isn't it?
It is. So, having said that those were the challenges, what was the easiest part of writing a guide to the Wars of the Roses? The fact that you knew the story so well?
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic which I studied myself at university and which I've taught for, well, I had taught for a very long time. So I did feel that it was very familiar territory all the way through. But I mean, there's obviously a catch there in that you have to be aware of what has been written since you looked at a particular
Mm,
topic. So you can't rest on that. But it is a topic with which I'm very familiar. And obviously, to write novels, you've got to do, if you're going to do it properly, you've got to do an immense amount of research. So I've been building on my initial knowledge, my basic knowledge for years before I tackled this. And I actually like writing,
mm,
and I felt that the book has a useful purpose. I felt that I was otherwise, to be honest with you, I wouldn't have bothered. But because I felt there was a purpose to the book to try and achieve a bit more clarity in this topic,
mm,
I felt I was doing something that was worthwhile. And for me, I have to be doing something that I actually believe is a good idea. Otherwise, I shan't do it. As simple as that.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I enjoyed writing it, and I enjoyed really every aspect of it, and that was what made it really easy anyway. How about you?
I think it's the same that I do actually enjoy writing. So it didn't feel like a
Mm.
chore at any stage, Scotland's medieval queens. I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. I thoroughly enjoyed looking into the history of Scotland itself
Mm,
because the whole idea is not to just write about the women, it's to tell Scotland's story while putting the women in the spotlight. So you still have, it's not like Robert the Bruce is not there, and it's not like Malcolm Canmore is not there. Scotland's story is still there, but
mm.
the women, the roles of the women, which are often just ignored or mentioned in one line, given more prominence.
Yeah, it's like where you've got a picture where some figures are in color and others are just silhouettes. The
Yeah,
women are the silhouettes, and
yeah.
what you're doing is you're coloring them in really in
Mm.
the picture.
Well, what I say, they were there, they were all, women were always there. The wives, the queens, the daughters, they were always there. They were always in the story, just like we are now. But
Mm,
they just weren't written down. So focusing on Scotland's queens, you're just putting them back in the story. You're making the story
mm,
whole. It wasn't whole when you're only looking at the kings.
yeah,
You have to say what the women were doing at the time to make it whole. And women as queens had a really important role in English history and Scottish history. Queens were seen as intercessors.
mm,
They asked for mercy. They allowed kings to be merciful because you've got this woman kneeling to her husband saying, "Oh, please be kind to this man." It allowed the king to actually say, "Okay, I will give you mercy," without him having to back
yeah,
down
yeah.
because men didn't like to back down.
Apparently,
So you've got that, and a lot of the time you see that the art and culture in the Scottish court was brought by the Queen
mm,
and encouraged by the Queen, and patronage of artists, of writers, but of the church as well. And a lot of the primary sources we have of gifts from the king with the Queen or the Queen on her own, often with the permission of her husband. And,
mm,
um, and that's what I found the easiest bit, just being able to tell their story and slotting them straight back into the history and saying this is where they were
yeah,
when this was happening and this is what they did. And then you get to the Wars of the Roses part and you see how the Scottish queens during the Wars of the Roses
yeah,
actually played a prominent role affecting the Wars of the Roses. They welcomed Margaret of Anjou and then changed minds and started like helping the Yorkists and things like that. And it's really that was Mary of Gelders. Sorry, I've never mentioned her name. And it was
mm,
really interesting to see how some of the women affected history and some were affected by history.
mm,
Because
yeah,
we have a long history of Scottish kings dying young. So we have a long history of Scottish queens trying to hold on to their sons and act as regents. It was interesting to see how not all of them did it successfully. I think Mary of Gelders was probably one of the most successful Scottish queens as regents. Most of them, they only held on to it for a short time or ended up getting married and losing it that way. So, yeah, it was. I was just so fascinated by the whole subject that I think I found it easy to write about because it was like, I'm there thinking, I'm loving this.
yeah, yeah.
So I was going to ask you if you come across anything particularly intriguing or gruesome stories that you weren't familiar with, or that maybe you were looking at a different angle when you were writing non-fiction.
Not so much gruesome. I'm sure. I mean, there were gruesome things that went on in the Wars of the Roses, but most of them were not terribly important in terms of what
Mm.
actually happened. They were kind of sideshows. There's a lot of grey areas in this topic. There's a lot of things we don't know, and one of the things I I tried to get across was the fact that we don't know some things doesn't mean that we don't know anything. And one of the modern assumptions about this period is that, oh well, if we don't know very much, you can say more or less anything you like. And that was what I was trying to get away from. But the thing that intrigued me most
Yes.
before I started, I mean, it's the elephant in the room. We've mentioned it several times already because you can't get away from it. Is this Leviathan character of Richard III. Richard III reigned for 5 minutes, and ever since, somehow or other, particularly in the 20th century and the 21st century, has become this massive historical figure.
Mm.
He probably reigned, how long did Harold Harefoot reign? Not very long, but Harold Godwinson, he didn't reign for long, but he's become quite a massive figure as well. The length of time that you rule does not have any relationship to how the public psyche sees you.
Mm.
And Richard III has become this large, so much larger than life figure that the real Richard III, I mean, I've seen that's sure, I'm sure it's a book title somewhere, The Real Richard III, and it's bandied about all over the place. This is what he was really like.
Definitely a Facebook group.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely a Facebook group.
And none of us actually know what the real Richard III was like
No.
because it's a long time ago and we don't know enough. But what I tried to do was to get through that intriguing development. I just stripped it down and said, okay, I'm just going to say what he did.
Mm.
And I'm going to say why he might have done it. You know, I'm not going to make any claims for him because that's ludicrous. And this whole business of the princes in the tower, which you'd think would be really central to my book, it isn't. Because the death of the princes in the tower, or the disappearance, or the continued existence on planet Mars, whatever happens to the princes in the tower is irrelevant to the accession of Richard III. And what we've become obsessed with is, did he kill the princes? Did he have them killed or not? And it really doesn't matter because that's not the reason he became king. He didn't kill them, then become king.
No.
So, it's irrelevant to what actually happened politically in England. What mattered was lots of people thought he had at the time.
Mm.
And so they based their actions on what they thought,
Yes.
not whether he actually had. I mean, the guy could have been blameless on that. Although,
Mm.
more recently that's looking less likely, but he might have been completely blameless on that particular thing, but it doesn't matter because he was already king.
Yeah.
So that's not the reason that he became king. So I've tried to things which intrigue me are those, how did it ever happen that people thought this?
Mm.
That's what I was trying to sort of strip away. But it is the whole persona of Richard III is very interesting
Mm.
and wholly misleading, I would think. But yeah, I mean, he's neither a villain, he's not a monster, he's a human being. And yes, some human beings are monsters. I don't think he was, but I've just tried to remove that stigma, that blame, that hero worship, get rid of all that. That's what I've tried to do in that.
That's the thing. He's very polarizing.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is ludicrous. I mean,
Mm.
the guy died hundreds of years ago. You see it, don't you? People say, "Oh, I hate Henry Tudor,"
Yeah, it's like you never met him.
or "I hate Richard III." They're dead. They've been dead for hundreds
Mm.
of years. You having an opinion on what they did
Yeah.
is valid, but you hating them is ridiculous. So, yeah, I've tried to get away from all that, hopefully. Now, how about you? Any gruesome stories that affecting medieval queens?
Well, yeah,
Medieval Scottish queens?
I came across a couple actually. There was one, Ungaron de Cousy, who was Queen Marie de Cousy's brother. And you think, this poor bloke, he was riding through a ford one day. His horse slipped. He fell off the horse and got dragged with his foot still in the stirrup. And somehow his sword left its scabbard and stabbed him. And he ended up dead as a doornail, basically. But it's like this sequence of events. And I'm sat there writing it down, giggling my head off, thinking, this poor bloke.
How did his sword, if he's being dragged along the ground, how does his sword coming out of his scabbard? It'd be behind him, surely.
How does the sword come out? It's like, I think there's probably more to that story, to be honest. I'm wondering where his squire was at the time.
Yeah, did he have a friend with him?
Yeah. And then there was the another one, which is Margaret of England, Henry III's daughter, was married to Alexander III of Scotland. And she'd had a rough time in childbirth, so it took a long time to heal. And a couple of months later, she's picnicking by the side of the river with her ladies and a few squires. And it's a warm summer day, and she just looks at the river, and the squire stood a little too close to the river, and she just gigglingly pushes him in, thinking, oh, this'll be, what a jape. Pushes the squire into the river, and everybody's giggling and laughing their heads off, and nobody notices that the squire can't actually swim, except this young page who must have been about 9 or 10. He jumps in to try and save the squire, and of course they both end up drowned. And it's like you've got this beautiful summer's day, everybody's having japes and giggles, and by the end of it, it's a horrific story because a man and boy die just because the Queen thought it'd be fun to push the squire into the river. Now, I think it was the Lanarkos Chronicle presents it as a judgment. Apparently, the squire had been given as a gift by Edward I to Margaret, but he was a de Montfort supporter. So as far as the Lanarkos Chronicle was concerned, he got his just desserts. So I'm not sure how accurate the Lanarkos Chronicle was, but it was a different take on the story.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, suddenly he deserved to die, really. So yeah, there are some gruesome parts to Scottish history.
And that's what you're up against is the bias of the sources, isn't it? Constantly. Very difficult to disentangle things sometimes.
It is, but Scottish chroniclers are great with their stories and making everything sound so colourful. And of course, the other thing you get with the Scottish chroniclers is every queen is compared to St Margaret. The Malcolm III's wife. If you're a good queen, you did something like St Margaret would have done. If you're a bad queen, then Margaret would have done it differently. So it was interesting when I was trying to research Margaret, because you look for St Margaret in the you put in the search Margaret, and she's everywhere. And you think you've got Margaret of England, Henry III's daughter, and suddenly no, he's referring to St Margaret again.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of Margarets. But the thing is, I guess, once you've said Saint Margaret, you've already strayed from reality in a sense, because this is someone who the church has kind of, well, sanctified, beatified or whatever. And so there's an immediate problem with that, isn't there, really? To try and get to what the woman was actually like. I mean, it could be completely true. Could be a realistic appraisal of this queen, or it could be, a bit like Henry VI's tutor saying everything that was, pious and all the rest of it, because he was looking at it from the spiritual perspective.
Yeah, with St Margaret, it's all about how she deprived herself. And I mean, she was basically bones by the time she died. She fasted an awful lot. But when you actually look at her, she was a very well educated woman. She was educated in Eastern Europe and then came to England with her father in about 1057. But she also educated her children. She made sure her sons and daughters were well educated. Her daughters were sent to a convent in England.
Yes, that's right.
To continue their education. But she oversaw the education of her children. So, and to me, that I find that more interesting than the piety, the fact that she saw value in not just educating her sons, but her daughters as well.
What I've learned in this process is that non-fiction is about trying to work out what people did and judging them on what they did rather than what people said they were like.
Yes.
And I found the section on St Margaret really interesting because her background was enormously interesting and significant. And then she was catapulted into Scotland, and again she took on this life, a different life. It was a very interesting section.
And then you see that it was her son, her youngest son David, who would be David I, King of Scots, and support his niece Empress Matilda in the anarchy in England, but he was the one who promoted the concept of Margaret becoming a saint.
Mm,
It's interesting that it was so within living
yeah.
memory that she was made a saint rather than 300 years
Mm,
later.
yeah.
But yeah, she set the style of queenship for all medieval queens of
Yeah.
Scotland.
She changed the landscape, didn't she, really, for Scottish queens?
Yeah, and you see, the chronicles refer to whether or not other queens acted like Queen Margaret. They always refer back to Saint Margaret. Two,
Mm,
300 years later, they're referring back to Saint Margaret. She set that style, and she
yeah.
was like a template for how Scottish queens should act after her. And I don't think she was a bad example to follow,
No.
to be honest. I think a lot of the things she did meant that queens had a role beyond
Mm.
just being mothers in
And the
Scottish
other thing
history.
about her is she demonstrates very well how influential a woman could be in a time period
Yes.
where one would imagine a woman wasn't very influential. She's a good example of what a woman could achieve in that role.
Mm, yeah, definitely. So you see this passing down time and again from St Margaret to Ada de Warenne to the future queens, where they all have benefited from the influence
Yeah,
that the earlier queens
yeah.
managed to carve out for themselves, whether it's in politics or
Mm,
in land holding, so that they had this set of land that was their dower rights and their income, personal income that they could use for patronage and to support themselves, irrespective of whether or not they were queen or widowed queen, queen mother. 13th century, you get Joan, who was married to David II and was the
mm,
sister of Henry III, actually acting as a diplomat in her private family letters rather than using the
yeah.
official diplomatic channels. Joan would write to Henry going, "Oh, David says we need to sort this. We need to think a bit more." And actually opening channels that were more of a personal nature, but
Mm,
it meant that you got things done
yeah,
rather
yeah,
than toing and froing with heralds.
yeah,
And that was interesting. It sort of explains why England's kings were happy for their
yeah.
daughters to marry Scottish kings, because it meant you had these
Mm,
family channels that could circumvent the political and diplomatic channels. And I think that's what worked so well with Henry III and why there was such a long period in the
yeah,
13th century of peace, because they could talk to each other. But then you get the 14th century with Edward III, whose sister is also Queen of Scots, funnily enough, married to David II, and he decides to back the other side, Edward Balliol, and tries to kick his brother-in-law off the throne. Who cares if it
yeah,
means he's kicking his sister off as well? So I suppose
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
personalities and intentions involved. Yeah, Edward III just liked to stir things up a bit, and
Yes, yeah,
what
yeah,
England always thought was Scotland,
yeah.
a weak Scotland, was beneficial to England. So yeah, it's fraught with drama.
I've read about first half, I think,
Yeah.
and certainly a lot of drama. There's a lot of things going on, and as I said, I particularly liked because
Mm,
I'm interested in that sort of period, but I like the St Margaret bit because of her role and influence. It made sense to me of a number of things I was a bit hazy on in that period, and I think the whole book probably does that as
mm,
well. As English-centered people, our grasp of Scottish history is probably flawed, and what this does in a way is it is it kind of gives you a way in to seeing how Scottish history meshes with English history, I think.
Yeah. I tried my best to not be Anglo-centric with it. I was very aware
No,
that
no.
although I have a great granddad who's Scottish,
Mm,
that I've my history has always been presented from the English viewpoint. So I did try
yeah.
and focus from the Scottish viewpoint so that, the English are the bad guys in it.
Yeah, no, and you've achieved that. Yeah, that works
Oh,
well.
thank you. That's good to
Um,
know.
yeah, I mean that's I'm sure that was very important in the writing
Mm,
of it. But that you need to take, as it were, the Scottish
yeah.
line rather than the English
Yeah,
line.
not to be biased
Um,
towards Scotland, but just present it from their
yeah.
viewpoint rather than the English one. I think Scottish history is very
Mm,
underrated, and there is not, and maybe it's because we're south of the border, but when you look around for Scottish history books and that, there aren't as many as, well, there probably aren't as many as there are just on the walls of the roses.
yeah, yes, probably. There's far too many on the Wars of the
Yeah.
Roses. Goodness, who needs another book on the Wars of the Roses?
I think a guide to the Wars of the Roses is a perfect idea, actually. It's just because everything's been so bogged down with trying to analyze each battle and
Mm,
each political motive, just to have the basic, this is what happened, this is
mm,
who was involved. I think you really do a great job of saying who everybody is
yeah.
and keeping explaining who, like when Buckingham appears at St Albans or Holland. I didn't know Holland was one of the candidates for the Protectorate.
Yeah. Well, he was as far as he was concerned. No, he's a great character in the sense that he's completely clueless, but he's
Mm,
he's up there because he's got the bloodline.
yeah.
And this is the thing, you've got blood was important. But having the right bloodline was important, not because of the throne, but just influence.
Mm,
It helped. But yeah, he pops up every now and again. And with this topic, lots of people pop up now and
yes.
again, which is why you need to sort of try and keep your eye on the ball and say where they come from. And sometimes it's very hard to find out what happens to them
Mm,
because they then they drop off the edge of the world, they
yeah.
disappear because some chronicler felt they weren't important enough to mention. So
Mm.
that's quite difficult.
And I like how you didn't get distracted by trying to decide what Henry VI's illness was,
Yeah,
which a lot of books do. And it's like, we don't know.
no.
We can't diagnose from 600 years later.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to dismiss all of those things. I mean, there's nothing wrong with somebody writing about that and exploring that, of course. But it wasn't, I didn't want to get sidetracked
Mm,
into these blind alleys, really. I wanted
yeah.
to have a narrative which people could follow, which took them forward all the time into the topic and didn't sort of go down a blind alley,
Mm.
which they said, which I then said, well, forget about that now. We're moving on to something else. Try and keep it clear or as clear as I could.
I have to say, Henry VI, he was, what was he, in a catatonic state or something for 15 months?
Yeah,
It's amazing that he survived, that they could manage to get food down him and that.
yeah. I mean, it is unusual, I think, and bewildering. And I think one of the things that is rarely touched on is how bewildering this was for the council, for those around him, and so on. This was not something that happened every day.
No.
He's the king. He's the lawgiver. He's the man who makes
Mm,
decisions. However good or bad he might be at doing that, he's the one that has to do it. So
yeah.
if he's not doing it, what the hell do you do? How do you cope with it? And for months they didn't do anything about it because they weren't quite sure what to do. Hope for the best and pray.
Yeah, they were just hoping he'd snap out of it.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was only when the Chancellor died and they needed a new Chancellor and realised
absolutely.
the only
Yeah,
one who can appoint a Chancellor is the King,
yeah.
they've got to do something about it.
Well, that's right. And I mean, it's just strange that it doesn't appear to me that many people have focused on this before, that the government sort of well, limps on, I
Mm,
suppose, until that point. And it's not like, it's not like he's had an arrow in the eye. It's not like he's mortally wounded. It's not even as if he's sort of ill in bed.
mm,
It's just he might as
yeah.
well not be there. He's visible but uncommunicative. So that's really different for these people at the time. This was beyond their experience, really.
Mm.
And I think we tend to forget that.
I think it shows, as does Scotland medieval queens, how central to good government were the people at the top, the king and queen,
Yeah, yeah,
and the partnership they worked and the way patronage worked and royal officers.
yeah,
It all came from the top, from the king.
yeah,
So, and vicariously from the Queen, who often was the one who whispered in the King's ear who he should appoint and why someone would be better than somebody else.
yeah. Well, patronage is what everything was about, really.
Yeah. And I think we've often forget nowadays because we have this, everything's done by the government and the King's a figurehead.
Mm.
We forget how necessary it was for the King to be able to act and appoint officers. So I suppose it's left to ask now, what are you working on now, Derek?
Loads of things, actually, far more things than I should be, really. Main writing at the moment is a sequel to my modern crime thriller, Eyes Like Blades, as yet untitled. Well, it is titled, but I'm not telling you what it is. But that sequel, I'm writing that at the moment. That's my main element of writing. I'm a bit into a sequel to Rebel Sword, which was the medieval story set during the Anarchy,
Mm,
which also came out last year. I have to say last year now because it's 2025.
yeah.
I have been doing some research. I've started to do some research on writing another book on the last of the Romans hero, Ambrosius Aurelianus. So I'd quite like to pick that up
Oh,
a
good.
little bit later on and talk about
Mm,
his struggle with the Saxons and so on. So there's that. And the other thing that's in the back of my mind, I was trying to think of non-fiction projects because I've obviously got all the time in the world to do that. Um, but the one thing I've got my father's diary from the Second World War. He was in the desert for more than 5 years in from 39 to
wow.
45. And he also had a camera with him and he took loads of photographs of where he was.
Mm,
So he kept a diary, had all the photographs, and I keep intending to edit the diary. I mean, I have edited it to some extent, but I intend to edit the diary, put the photo of many photos as I can in it, and produce that as a non-fiction work. Because I know there's still an awful lot of interest in all aspects of the
yes.
Second World War. So that's on the back
Mm,
burner. So I might take that a bit further this year. Who knows? It's a human story, really. It's about a young man
mm,
whose life is going in one direction, and then in September 1939, he goes in a completely different direction, and he's overseas. He's never been abroad before, obviously. He's
yeah.
on a troop ship, and he's on his way to Egypt, where he doesn't even know where he's going because obviously they didn't tell them where they were going. They just turn up there, and then he's got 5 years in this sort
Mm,
of alien culture, which he obviously gets used to. Bouts of dysentery every 5 minutes, scorpions in his boots, and all the rest of it. And I think it's a human interest story rather than a war story.
yeah.
He meets my mother by means of letters written that the nurses were asked to write to servicemen, and other servicemen. They didn't know the person they were writing to at all.
Ah,
And his relationship with her
yeah.
came out of those letters. They didn't meet until he got back to England.
Oh.
So it's a very good human interest
Mm,
story. It's just whether I get around to actually doing it.
mm.
So what about you? What are you up to?
Well, I am just finishing the medieval princess from the
Right.
conquest to the Wars of the Roses. So basically the daughters of the kings of England.
Crikey, there must be a lot of those.
There are a lot of them. And I decided I'd also put Henry the First's illegitimate daughters in a chapter as well.
You could write a book about his illegitimate children.
Yeah, you could, especially Julianne, the one who tried to kill him.
How many illegitimate daughters
I
did he
think
have?
I've got 8 we definitely know about.
Right,
And there are some that might be or might not be, and things like that. And I
right.
mean, one was on the White Ship with her brother
Yes,
William
yeah.
and got blamed for his death because apparently he heard her shouting and came back to rescue her, and his boat got swamped. So then there's Julianne, who tried to kill her dad with a crossbow bolt. Um,
I'm already liking this book. This sounds good.
and one, of course, Sybil, became Queen of Scotland.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's that's the chapter I'm working on at the minute.
So where does it go? Sorry, you did say I missed it.
All the
Where
way
does it go
to
up to?
Ed. Well, I was going to finish at Edward the Fourth's daughters, and then I remembered Richard the Third had one as well, didn't he? An
Yes,
illegitimate
yeah,
daughter.
yeah.
So it's going to end with the Yorkist daughters.
Right.
Although I'm not going to go too much into detail with them because a couple of them are in heroines of the Tudor world, and we're getting
Yeah.
into the Tudor rather than the medieval by that point. Luckily, it's a bit shorter than you would expect because Henry V and Henry VI didn't have any daughters, and Richard the Second didn't have any daughters. So
Yeah.
there's a few
Yeah.
chapters I can skip over.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's been interesting. I think the most interesting one is Henry IV's daughters because I've never really done anything about Henry IV. So his daughters, Blanche and Philippa, I have no research on them whatsoever until I started doing this one.
Mm,
Everybody else, I've sort of already got details on them.
yeah.
But with those two, I never even looked at them, which was quite interesting
Mm,
to actually do something totally new and fresh.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then once that's done, which will hopefully be the end of next month at the latest, I'm going on to medieval rebel women,
All right. Okay.
which is looking at women who sort of rebelled against their expected role. So Eleanor of
Right.
Aquitaine's going to be in there because she rebelled against Henry II. Julianne will turn up again, firing her crossbow at Henry I. But there's also Jeanne de Clisson, who's a French uh, Breton who turned pirate,
Mm.
and a few others in there. I haven't got them all yet.
So is it medieval rather than English?
Yeah, I'm still looking at including. I think I've got about 14 women at the minute,
That's
but I'm
quite a
still
lot,
looking
isn't
at
it?
more to include. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sounds good.
Problem is, I want to get this book finished because I'm looking forward to starting on that
Yes,
one.
that's always the way, isn't it? And then you finish one and you kind of close the door on that, and then somebody asks you about it, and you think,
Mm.
now, what was that about?
Yeah, exactly.
You're always on the next book, aren't you?
Yeah. And you get stuck into the next one, and then you get the edits back and have to go through them. So yeah, there's always something
Oh, it
going
sounds like
on.
we're both going to be quite
Yes,
busy.
always something going on.
Plus the podcasts, of course.
Yes, plus the podcast and working out who to invite and who to look into,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's always enjoyable.
yeah,
So I suppose it remains for us to say, please go out and buy A Guide to the Wars of the Roses by Derek Birks and Scotland's Medieval Queens from St Margaret to Margaret of Denmark by Sharon Bennett Connolly. They will both be in the bookshops by the end of January.
yeah,
We've actually timed it so the podcast goes out more or less when the books are released.
yeah, yeah. It's almost as if it's planned.
Yeah, and it wasn't. It was just, oh, we need to talk about the books. So I hope we've whetted your appetite and to encourage you to read both books. I can personally say that A Guide to the Wars of the Roses is very enjoyable.
Yeah, and I can echo that thought for Scottish medieval queens.
So thank you for joining us. Do join us next time when we will be talking to Peter Gibbons about the Anglo-Saxons. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. You might like to know that all our podcasts are now available on YouTube. Just search on A Slice of Medieval and don't forget to subscribe either on YouTube or your favourite podcast provider. Also, remember to give us a like or a comment if you have a minute. Thanks for listening.